Welcome to the third part of Humanist literary theory. Here we analyze William Wordsworth, Samuel Taylor Coleridge, John Keats, Edgar Allan Poe, and Matthew Arnold. William Wordsworth, 1770 to 1850. The critics and theorists, from Sir Philip Sidney to Sir Joshua Reynolds, broadly represent the thinking of the Age of Enlightenment and its debates about the relative importance of reason and imagination. These critics insist that the ancient Greeks and Romans provide the best models for 18th century art, that art is remarkable for its artifice and artificiality, and that the highest forms of art come from and are appreciated most by those with well trained, classically trained sensibilities. William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge's preface to the second edition of Lyrical Ballads, published in 1800, articulates the romantic, philosophical, and aesthetic worldview. The romantic conception of art and artists directly challenged the beliefs of the Enlightenment, particularly in insisting on the superiority of all things natural over anything artificial. Wordsworth overturned centuries of accepted thought about poetry in stating that a poet is a man speaking to man, and that poetry must use the language of common speech. The human interaction with the natural world provides the inspiration and source of all poetry, according to the Romantic view. And so the language used to present these interactions must work to recreate that naturalness. Wordsworth and the Romantics in general set up a value system in which the rural is valued over the urban. Nature is better than culture, and the uneducated and simple are closer to nature than the educated and complex. In stating that the child is the father of the man, Wordsworth declares that children have a sensibility which adults have lost. Wordsworth is more concerned with the relation between the poet and the poem than with the poem and its reader. He is not particularly interested in the moral effect of poetry. He focuses on examining what a poem is, how it is made, and who makes it, rather than on what it does. A poem, he proclaims, is not the product of reason or of art and artifice, but is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings, which takes its origin from emotion recollected in tranquility. Feeling is thus established as the central element in a poem, more important than action, situation, character, or mimetic accuracy. The purpose of a poem is not to teach overtly, not to shape thought, character, or action, but to express and produce powerful emotion. From this, Wordsworth concludes, "A poem is good insofar as it is an authentic expression of feelings generated in a natural setting." The poet who can produce such authentic expression of feeling is a kind of superhuman being, a receptive soul. Obviously, in this romantic view, feeling, sensibility, and emotion are more important capacities than reason and logic. Reason dissects and breaks up experience to analyze it, while feeling unifies it. The intellect can only grasp nature in pieces, while the imagination grasps it in its entirety. Samuel Taylor Coleridge, 1772 to 1834. Coleridge insists that art in general and poetry in particular constitutes special modes of knowledge. While reason creates divisions and categories, art values the unity of subject and object, the union of human and nature. For Wordsworth, the artist's heightened sensibility sets him apart from the rest of humanity. Coleridge takes that separateness and elevates the artist to the status of a god who can create worlds that have never before existed. Coleridge's critical writings, including On the Principles of Genial Criticism, published in 1814, and his Biographia Literaria, published in 1817, emphasize the idea of organicism as central to the Romantic worldview. The language and form of poetry, its language and meter, have to arise organically, naturally, spontaneously from the interaction of the poet and the natural world. Form, in this view, is always something internal to the poem or work of art, rather than something imposed externally. The poet is free to make his own rules about poetic expression and to create his own forms unique to his particular experience. Poetry thus ceases to be governed by inherited rules about meter and is freed from its imitative ties to a tradition of poetic precursors whose excellence has been proved by the test of time. Thus, the idea of aesthetic quality, whether a work of art is good or bad, in the Romantic view, depends not on any conception of conformity, either in the accuracy of a representation or to existing norms and conventions, but rather in the originality of the work and in its ability to express and produce powerful emotions. Coleridge also examines the faculty of the imagination, dividing it like Burke into a primary and secondary form. Primary imagination is the living power of human perception, the presence in each and every human soul of the divine spark of creative power, which is the life force itself, or as Coleridge describes it, a repetition in the finite mind of the eternal act of creation in the infinite I am. Primary imagination is unconscious, a universal given of human existence. Secondary imagination, by contrast, is the conscious act of creation. It enables the poet or artist to dissolve, dissipate, and diffuse sensory impressions in order to recreate, reorder, and unify them. Primary imagination is experience itself. Secondary imagination is the ability to take experience apart and put it back together again in a new form. John Keats, 1795 to 1821. Keats' conception of poetry, as articulated in his letters to Benjamin Bailey and George and Thomas Keats in 1870, follows the romantic path established by Wordsworth and Coleridge. Rational thought breaks the world into subject and object for the purposes of classification and analyzes in the Aristotelian process known as science. Sensations, empathetic experiences, and poetry, however, break down the boundaries between subject and object and insist on the interplay between the two. Poetry and science, empathy and reason are incompatible and oppositional for Keats. The poet must possess a quality that Keats calls negative capability, which is the ability to stay in, be comfortable with uncertainties, indeterminacies, mysteries, and doubts without needing to find some resolution or certainty. Keats here articulates what would increasingly become a central conflict in literary studies in the 20th century. Formalist criticism would focus on finding a resolution or an explanation for the unity of elements in a poem, while post-structuralism would recall Keats' negative capability and the need for ambiguity and flux rather than answers. Edgar Allan Poe, 1809 to 1849. Poe's critical writings, including The Poetic Principle, published in 1849, and The Philosophy of Composition, published in 1850, represent romantic ideas of poetry taken to an extreme. Poe insists that a poet's only concern should be the concentrated effect of the work to produce an intense emotional response in the reader. A poem should be short, to be read in one sitting, so as not to interrupt this effect, and should have as its central concern the presentation of the most universal emotion, which he decides is grief over the death of beauty. Poe also rejects entirely the instructional or didactic aspect of poetry. Its purpose is only to delight or to arouse, not to teach or moralize. Poe thus becomes one of the earliest advocates of art for art's sake, valuing poetry solely for its creation of feeling according to its own self-created internal coherence, without regard for any other external social effect or function that it might have. Matthew Arnold, 1822 to 1888. Our last representative in this overview of literary theorists who have articulated the central premises of humanism is the critic most closely associated with the humanist perspective and with the establishment of the humanities. and especially literary study, as a vital part of the high school and university curriculum. In The Function of Criticism at the Present Time, published in 1864, Arnold states that the goal of criticism is to see the object as in itself it really is, free of polemics, agendas, and preconceptions, in order to provide disinterested observation and assessment. This is the heart of what would be called New Criticism, the method of examining a literary text without reference to anything outside of the text itself. Familiarity with the best literature has the power, according to Arnold, to create what he calls sweetness and light, which are the hallmarks of civilization. The citizens who have been educated to appreciate the best will develop taste, sensibility, a quality Arnold calls high seriousness, and will be productive and peaceful members of their society. In short, Arnold tells us that a literary education in the best texts will indeed make us all better human beings and make our world an easier and more humane place to live. Matthew Arnold envisioned a high school and college education that would focus on training human beings to be fully human by ensuring that they have exposure to the arts, sciences, and humanities. The study of literature specifically would work to articulate the middle class values of culture preached by Arnold. Thank you for watching this video.